The rain came down hard on the roof of the old Honda Civic, the kind of rain that does not pass through, the kind that settles in for the night and tells you the night is going to be long. Adelaide Ashcroft sat behind the wheel with the engine off and the wipers still. She was 68 years old. Her hair had gone white years ago. Her hands, the same hands that had once typed dictation for some of the most powerful men in Boston, were folded in her lap around a single object. A key, iron, rusted at the teeth, heavy in a way that modern keys never are, the kind of key that belonged to another century. She had been sitting there for 40 minutes. The lawyer's office was 4 blocks behind her. The mansion she had lived in for 40 years was 3 miles ahead. The world she had known when she walked into that office this morning was gone, and the world she was supposed to walk into tonight was not yet a world she could imagine. She looked at the key. She turned it slowly in her fingers. She did not cry. There was a place inside her where the crying lived, and she could feel it pressing against the walls. But she had not opened that door yet. She had a feeling that if she opened it now, in this car, in this rain, she would not be able to close it again. So she sat, and she breathed, and she looked at the key. After 40 years, she thought, this is what they gave me. 40 years of mornings, 40 years of dinners, 40 years of being the woman who walked into a room and made everyone in it feel taken care of. 40 years of standing behind a man whose name was painted on the side of a building downtown. And in the end, when the man was gone and the lawyer read the words out loud, what they handed her across the polished conference table was this: a piece of rusted iron and an address she had never heard of. She closed her hand around the key. The metal bit into her palm. She let it. You have to go back to understand. You have to go back 40 years to a spring afternoon in 1984 when a young woman named Adelaide Hollister sat at a typewriter in a law office on State Street in Boston, and a man twice her age stood in the doorway and watched her work. She did not know he was watching. She was 28 years old. She was the youngest secretary in the firm. She had been hired 3 weeks earlier on the strength of a typing test and a letter of recommendation from a teacher at the community college. She had grown up in a triple-decker in Dorchester. Her father had been a longshoreman. Her mother had cleaned houses in the Back Bay for 31 years. Adelaide had been raised on the idea that the people who lived in the houses her mother cleaned were a different species. Not better, not worse, just different. The way deer are different from horses. And now here she was, typing motions and depositions for one of those people. His name was Reginald Ashcroft. He was 45 years old that spring, a senior partner, a widower, 3 children at home, Bartholomew 20 on the verge of finishing at Bowdoin, Genevieve 18 just starting at Wellesley, and the youngest Sterling 16 still in prep school out in Weston. Reginald Ashcroft was not a tall man. He was not a loud man. He was a man with very still hands and very quiet shoes, and when he walked into a courtroom, the air in the courtroom changed. Adelaide had seen it happen. She had sat in the back row once on a slow Friday, watching him cross-examine a hostile witness. The witness was a man twice his size. By the end, the witness was apologizing for things he had not been asked about. That was Reginald Ashcroft. And one Tuesday afternoon in May, he stood in the doorway of the secretarial pool and watched Adelaide type and at the end of the day, he walked over to her desk and asked her in a voice quieter than the typewriters around them if she might be free for dinner that evening. She said yes before she had time to think. She wore the only dress she owned that did not smell of mothballs. He took her to a steakhouse on Boylston Street where the menu had no prices. She ordered the chicken because she was afraid to ask what anything cost. He ordered a bottle of wine that had a year on the label older than her mother. And by the end of the meal, he had told her about his dead wife and his 3 children and the mortgage on the house in Beacon Hill, and Adelaide had thought in the clear, quiet way that young women sometimes think very dangerous thoughts. This is a man who needs me. 6 months later, he asked her to marry him. She said yes again. They were married on the second Saturday of November 1984. A small ceremony at Trinity Church. 40 guests. Reginald's 3 children sat in the front row in matching dark suits, and not one of them smiled. At the reception in the receiving line, Genevieve leaned in to kiss Adelaide on the cheek, the way a daughter kisses a stepmother for a photograph. Her lips never touched skin. Her breath was cold against Adelaide's ear. "You will never," Genevieve said quietly, "be our mother. Don't even try." She pulled back. She smiled for the camera. The flash went off. That was the photograph that ended up on the mantelpiece in the front parlor for the next 40 years. For 40 years, Adelaide tried anyway. She tried in the morning when she woke up at 5:30 to make breakfast for a household that had a cook on weekdays. She tried at Christmas when she remembered every grandchild's birthday and every godchild's confirmation and every favorite dessert of every relative on Reginald's mother's side. She tried at Thanksgiving when she stood at the head of a table for 16 and carved the turkey because Reginald did not like to carve. She tried in August when she rented a house on the Cape that the children rolled their eyes at and complained was too small. She tried for 40 years. And for 40 years, the 3 children of Reginald Ashcroft watched her try and held themselves slightly apart and called her Adelaide instead of Mom or Della or anything else, and never once thanked her for anything she did, because a woman like Adelaide was paid to do the things she did, and you do not thank the help. That was how they thought of her. She had known it for years. She had told herself it would change. She had told herself that one day when the children were grown, when the resentments had aged into something softer, when the grandchildren came along and saw their grandmother as a grandmother and not as the woman who had taken their grandmother's place, the family would settle into something that looked like family. It never did. But Reginald was her own. She had believed that. For 40 years she had believed that. He brought her tea every morning. He kissed the top of her head when he came home from court. He wrote her letters when he traveled, actual letters on hotel stationery, handwritten, and sent them by mail, even when he was only going to be gone for 3 days. He told her once in their 10th year of marriage that she was the best decision he had ever made. He did not say it often, but he said it, and she believed him. Even on the weekends, because there were the weekends, once a month, sometimes more. For 40 years, Reginald would pack a small leather grip on a Friday afternoon. He would kiss her on the forehead. He would tell her he was driving out to the property. The property. That was what he called it. Always. Never my house, never the cottage, never anything that would have given the place a name. Just the property. He had inherited it, he said, from his uncle Cornelius, an old place out west somewhere in the hill country between Pittsfield and the New York line. Nothing fancy, a stone house on a piece of land, a place where a man could think. "I need somewhere that is just mine, Della," He had told her once very early in the marriage, "Surely you understand." She did understand. She thought she did. She thought every man needed a place to think. Her own father had had a workshop in the basement that he disappeared into every Sunday afternoon, and her mother had never once asked what he did down there. So Adelaide did not ask. For 40 years she did not ask. He would leave on Friday afternoons. He would come home on Sunday evenings. Sometimes he would bring back a jar of honey from a roadside stand. Sometimes a small bunch of dried lavender. Once in 1991, a small framed sketch of a stone wall which he hung in his study and never explained. She did not ask about the sketch. She did not ask about anything. There was one moment once when she almost did. It was in the spring of 2003. She had been moving Reginald's old gym bag out of the front closet to make room for a new vacuum cleaner. The bag had not been used in years. The zipper was stuck. She had to wrestle with it, and when it finally gave, a folded piece of paper fell out onto the floor. A gas station receipt, dated 4 months earlier. The station was in a town called Cedarbrook. She had never heard of Cedarbrook. She had stood there in the front hall in her cleaning apron with the receipt in her hand. She had thought about it for a long time. She had thought about asking him at dinner. She had thought about looking up Cedarbrook in an atlas. She had thought about 100 small dark things that a woman thinks about when her husband has been disappearing on weekends for 19 years. And then she had folded the receipt back up. She had tucked it into the pocket of her apron. She had finished moving the vacuum cleaner. And that night when Reginald came home from the office, she had set his dinner in front of him and asked him about his day. She had thrown the receipt away 2 days later because she trusted him. That was the thing she would think about 40 years later, sitting in a Honda Civic in the rain with a rusted key in her hand. She had trusted him. And trust, she would learn far too late, was the foundation she had built her entire adult life on. Reginald Ashcroft died on the morning of the 11th of March. It was a Tuesday. Adelaide had brought him his coffee at 7 o'clock, the way she had brought him his coffee every morning of their marriage. She had walked into the bedroom with the white china cup on the silver tray and the small cream pitcher beside it. She had set the tray on the night table. She had said his name. He had not moved. She had said his name again. He had not moved. The doctor told her later that it had been a massive heart attack in his sleep. Instantaneous. He would not have felt anything. He would not have known. He had gone, the doctor said, as easily as a man could go. Adelaide had nodded. She had thanked the doctor for telling her. She had stood in the kitchen afterwards with the cup of coffee still warm, and she had drunk it herself, because it would have been a waste to throw it out. She had not cried. That was the thing she could not understand about herself in the days that followed. She had not cried. 40 years of marriage to a man she had loved, and the morning she found him cold in the bed beside her, she had stood in the kitchen and finished his coffee, and her eyes had been dry. She told herself it was shock. She told herself the tears would come later. She did not yet know that some part of her too quiet to be heard, had already begun to suspect that a different kind of mourning was waiting on the other side of all of this, a mourning that had nothing to do with grief. The funeral was on a Saturday. Reginald Ashcroft had been one of the most prominent attorneys in Boston for over 50 years. The church was full. There were people standing in the back. The mayor came. 2 federal judges came. A senator's chief of staff came. The senior partners of every major firm in the city sent flowers, and the flowers covered the front of the altar 3 deep. Adelaide stood at the door of the church in her black dress and shook hands with 500 people whose names she would not remember. When the service began, she walked down the aisle on Bartholomew's arm. He had insisted. He was the eldest son. It was his right. She had wanted to walk alone. She did not say so. At the front of the church, instead of leading her to the first pew, Bartholomew steered her gently to the second. "Just for the spacing, Adelaide," he murmured, "in case any of your family wants to sit with you." She had no family. Her parents had been dead for over 20 years. Her one cousin in Worcester was 84 and could not travel. She had sat in the second pew alone. In the front pew, where she should have been, Bartholomew sat with his wife and his 2 grown children. Genevieve sat beside them, with her current husband, her third, and the 2 children from her first marriage who barely spoke to her. Sterling sat at the end with his wife, who was 22 years younger than he was and would not look at Adelaide. The casket was at the front of the church. The flag of the Massachusetts bar was draped across it. The bishop spoke first, then the senior partner from Reginald's firm, then a federal judge, then a former governor. Each of them spoke for 10 minutes. Each of them spoke about Reginald Ashcroft, the brilliant attorney. Reginald Ashcroft, the devoted father. Reginald Ashcroft, the towering figure of the Boston bar. Reginald Ashcroft, the pillar of the community. Not one of them spoke about Reginald Ashcroft, the husband. Not one of them mentioned the woman in the second pew. She sat through all of it. She did not move. She did not weep. She kept her gloved hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the casket, and she waited for someone to say her name. No one said her name. When the service ended, the family processed out behind the casket. Bartholomew led the way. Genevieve walked beside him. Sterling came next. Adelaide came last. The reception afterwards was at Bartholomew's house in Wellesley, a house Reginald had paid for as a wedding gift 26 years earlier. Adelaide had never been comfortable in it. The rooms were too white. The furniture was too low. The art on the walls had been chosen by an interior designer who had once described Adelaide within Adelaide's hearing as charmingly suburban. She stood by the catering table for most of the reception. She held a glass of white wine she did not drink. She nodded at people whose faces she knew and whose names she had forgotten, and who in turn looked through her as if she were a piece of furniture that had been placed inconveniently near the food. Late in the afternoon, she walked past the kitchen on her way to the powder room. The kitchen door was open. Genevieve was inside. Genevieve was talking to her cousin Marcy and her oldest friend Bitsy, and a woman Adelaide did not recognize. "It's just so hard," Genevieve was saying. She had a glass of champagne in one hand and a cocktail napkin in the other, and she was using the napkin to dab at the corners of her eyes. The eyes themselves were perfectly dry. "Losing Daddy, but thank God we have each other, the real family, to get through this together." The real family. Adelaide had stopped walking. She had stood in the hallway. She had listened. "You know," Genevieve had gone on, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial register she had been using since she was 18. "It's going to be such a relief, frankly. Once we get through this week, once we get the will read and everything settled. Daddy was so good to her, so patient, for 40 years. But honestly, there comes a point." "There comes a point," Bitsy had agreed. 40 years, Genevieve had said. Imagine what he could have done with those 40 years if he hadn't. She had not finished the sentence. She had not needed to. The other women had nodded. They had murmured. They had touched Genevieve's arm in sympathy. Adelaide had stood in the hallway for another long moment. Then she had walked very quietly, very steadily the rest of the way to the powder room. She had gone inside. She had locked the door. She had sat down on the closed toilet seat in her black dress, and she had put her hands flat on her knees, and she had breathed. She had not cried. But something inside her, something that had been a soft thing for 40 years, had begun very slowly to harden. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Friday. It was held in the downtown office of Hollis Pemberton, a thin gray man in his late 70s who had been Reginald's personal attorney for the last 30 years. Adelaide had met him many times. He had come to dinners at the Beacon Hill house. He had toasted her on her 60th birthday. He had once sent her a small handwritten note after a charity gala, complimenting her on the way she had handled a difficult conversation between Reginald and a senior judge. That morning, when she walked into Hollis Pemberton's conference room, he stood up from the head of the table and came around to greet her. He did not smile. He took both of her hands in his. "Adelaide," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I argued. I argued for as long as I could." She did not understand what he meant. She thought for one wild, bright second that he was apologizing for the funeral, for the second pew, for the senator's chief of staff who had walked past her without speaking. She squeezed his hands and thanked him and went to her seat. She sat alone on one side of the long mahogany table. On the other side sat Bartholomew in a charcoal suit with a leather portfolio open in front of him and a fountain pen lined up along its edge. Beside him sat Genevieve in a black dress and pearls, with her hands folded and her face composed. Beside her sat Sterling, who was looking at his phone. Their 3 lawyers sat behind them. Hollis Pemberton sat at the head of the table. He cleared his throat. He opened the file. He began to read. For the first 10 minutes, he read the standard legal preamble, the testamentary capacity, the proper execution, the witnesses, the dates. Adelaide listened with her hands folded in her lap and her gaze on the polished surface of the table. She thought about the ring on her finger. She thought about the morning Reginald had given it to her in the drawing room of the Beacon Hill house on the first anniversary of their wedding. She thought about how he had knelt down on one knee, even though they were already married, and how he had said, "I should have done it this way the first time, my Della." Hollis got to the specifics. The estate of Reginald Ashcroft, he said in the careful, slow voice of a man who is reading a thing he wishes he were not reading, is valued at approximately $8.7 million. This includes the primary residence at 15 Lewisburg Square in Beacon Hill, valued at approximately $2.1 million. Investment accounts and securities totaling approximately $4.2 million. Retirement accounts of approximately $1.8 million. And miscellaneous personal property and effects valued at approximately $600,000. Adelaide's shoulders relaxed slightly. $8.7 million. It was more than enough to live the rest of her life on, more than enough that she could remain in the Beacon Hill house where every floorboard knew her step, more than enough that she could keep the rooms exactly as she had kept them, more than enough that when she was eventually gone, she could leave something behind for the children of friends who had been kind to her. Reginald had taken care of her. Of course he had. She had never doubted he would. The primary residence at 15 Lewisburg Square, Hollis read in the same slow, careful voice, is left in its entirety to Mr. Ashcroft's 3 children from his first marriage, Bartholomew Ashcroft, Genevieve Ashcroft Halloway, Sterling Ashcroft, to be divided in equal thirds or sold, and the proceeds divided in equal thirds at their discretion. The room was very quiet. Adelaide did not move. She felt her hands in her lap very far away. The investment accounts, Hollis went on, totaling approximately $4.2 million, to be divided in equal thirds among the same 3 children. He turned the page. The retirement accounts, $1.8 million, same distribution. Same. She heard a small sound. She did not know what it was. It might have been her own breath. It might have been the second hand of the clock on the wall. It might have been the sound of something inside her chest cracking very quietly somewhere just under the bone. Mr. Pemberton. Her own voice. Far away. Thin. Hollis. He looked up at her. His eyes were wet. What did Reginald leave for me? Hollis. Pemberton drew a long breath. I have to read this verbatim, Adelaide, he said. The language it is what your husband insisted on. I am very sorry. He looked down at the page. He read, My wife Adelaide Ashcroft has lived comfortably at my expense for 40 years. She has wanted for nothing during the course of our marriage. She has had the benefit of my wealth, my home, my social position, and a standard of living far beyond what she could have achieved on her own as a secretary. This is more than adequate compensation for the companionship and domestic services she has provided over the years. The room went very still. Companionship. Domestic services. Adelaide heard the words from a great distance, as if they had been said to someone else, as if she were watching them happen in a film to a woman who looked very much like her but was not quite her, and who was sitting very still in a black dress on the wrong side of a long table. While I have appreciated her presence in my home and her efficient management of domestic affairs, Hollis read on, his voice tight and careful, I believe my primary obligation and my truest legacy lies with my children and the continuation of the Ashcroft family name. They are my bloodline. They are my future. Therefore, to my wife Adelaide, I leave the following. Across the table, Bartholomew was smiling. He was not trying to hide it. His mouth had curled at the corner the way the mouth of a small boy curls when he has won a game his sister did not know they were playing. Genevieve was examining her fingernails. Sterling was still looking at his phone. 1. The property located at 47 Oakwood Lane in the township of Cedarbrook in the county of Berkshire in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, together with all contents contained therein. This property is given to Adelaide with the express understanding that she will vacate the Beacon Hill residence within 30 days of my death, as that property is needed by my children for their use or disposition as they see fit. Hollis Pemberton stopped reading. He did not look up. The silence in the room was the kind of silence you get in a courtroom when the verdict has just been read and no one has moved yet. Cedarbrook. The word floated up to Adelaide from a great depth. Cedarbrook. The gas station receipt. In the front pocket of a cleaning apron. 23 years ago. She had not thrown it away in time. The name had stayed in the back of her head. It had stayed there for 23 years, waiting the way certain words wait inside us for the moment they are going to mean something we did not want them to mean. Genevieve was the first to speak. "Oh, Adelaide," she said. Her voice was warm. Her voice was full of pity, the way certain perfumes are full of musk. Daddy mentioned that property to us years ago. Some old place out in the hills. He inherited it from a great uncle. He always said it wasn't worth the cost of the property taxes to maintain. He thought about selling it more than once, but he just never got around to it. She tilted her head. "At least," she said, "you'll have a roof over your head. That's something." Bartholomew stood up. The motion of his body in that suit in that conference room was the motion of a man who has just closed a deal. "We'll need to talk about the timeline for the Beacon Hill house," he said briskly. "We'll be putting it on the market right away. The market in that neighborhood is very strong right now. The sooner it's empty, the sooner we can get it staged. The will specifies 30 days. It was Hollis Pemberton. His voice had a small thread of steel in it. "Adelaide is legally entitled to 30 full days to arrange her affairs and to relocate. That is non-negotiable, Bartholomew." Of course, of course." Bartholomew waved a hand. The wave was small. The wave was generous. "We're not unreasonable people, Adelaide. Take your full 30 days. We understand this is a transition for you." He smiled at her. He smiled the way a hotel manager smiles at a guest whose check has bounced. Hollis slid a brown envelope across the polished surface of the table. His hand was trembling. Adelaide noticed. She did not know how she could notice such a small thing in such a large moment, but she noticed. "Inside this envelope," he said quietly, "is the deed to the Cedarbrook property transferred to your name, the key, and a handwritten note from Reginald that he asked me to include." Adelaide reached out. She picked up the envelope. It was heavier than an envelope should be. She did not open it. She tucked it under her arm. She stood up. Her legs held her, which surprised her. She had thought sitting in that chair that her legs were never going to hold her again. She did not look at Bartholomew. She did not look at Genevieve. She did not look at Sterling. She looked at Hollis Pemberton. "Thank you, Hollis," she said. He nodded. He could not speak. She walked out of the conference room. She walked down the long carpeted hallway past the receptionist who did not look up. She rode the elevator down to the lobby. She walked through the lobby out onto State Street. The rain had started. She walked to her car. She got in. She put the envelope on the passenger seat, and she sat, with her hands on the wheel, and she breathed. That was where you found her 40 minutes later with the rusted key in her hand and the rain coming down on the roof of the old Honda Civic. That was the moment. The moment a woman becomes a stranger to her own life. 68 years old, 40 years married, reduced in 2 paragraphs of legal English to the woman who had handled the domestic affairs. She closed her hand on the key. The 30 days that followed were the longest 30 days of Adelaide Ashcroft's life. She did not at first drive out to Cedarbrook. She told herself she was not yet ready. She told herself she needed to pack. She told herself that whatever was waiting at 47 Oakwood Lane could wait another week. She told herself a great many things. What she did instead was she stayed in the Beacon Hill house, and the children came. They came every day. They came in the morning, and they came in the afternoon. And once Bartholomew came at 7:30 in the evening with 2 contractors and a flashlight because he wanted to look at the basement before the showing on Saturday. They never knocked. They had keys, of course. They had had keys for years. The keys had been given to them as a courtesy and as a kindness, and as part of the long, quiet effort Adelaide had made over 40 years to make them feel that the house was as much theirs as it was hers. Now the keys were not a courtesy. Now the keys were a weapon. Bartholomew brought a real estate agent and a stager. The stager was a woman in her 30s in expensive boots who walked through the rooms with a clipboard and made small, dismissive sounds at the wallpaper. "This is going to have to come down," the stager said in the front parlor, gesturing at the silk damask Adelaide had chosen in 1991. "Buyers can't see past this kind of thing." She gestured at the rugs. "And these, definitely these, too dated." Adelaide stood in the doorway with a cup of tea growing cold in her hand. The stager did not see her, or saw her and looked through her the way one looks through a piece of furniture that has been left in the room by mistake. Genevieve brought an interior designer on a separate day because Genevieve was already thinking about which pieces of furniture she wanted to take for her own house and which pieces could be sold at auction and which pieces were not worth the cost of the moving truck. The designer was a man named Trevor. Trevor walked through the dining room and ran his hand along the long mahogany table where Adelaide had served Thanksgiving dinner 40 times. "This is a nice piece," he said. "Mid-century, good provenance. We could move it." "Can we get rid of these chairs, though?" Genevieve said. "I never liked these chairs. Those are good chairs. They're ugly." "They're not ugly. They're just brown." "Brown is ugly." Adelaide sat in the next room. She heard them through the wall. She did not move. Sterling came on a Wednesday afternoon. He brought a man Adelaide did not recognize. The man wore a suit and carried a briefcase. The man was an appraiser. Sterling walked the man through the house from the basement to the attic. He pointed at things. He made notes. He opened drawers. He opened cabinets. He opened the linen closet on the second floor and ran his hand along the stack of monogrammed sheets that had been Reginald's mother's, and then his first wife's, and then by a long, sad chain of inheritance Adelaide's. "These could go to a textile dealer," the appraiser said. "What's the floor on something like that?" "Maybe 400, maybe a little more. Depends on the buyer." Adelaide stood at the end of the hallway. She did not say anything. The appraiser looked up. He saw her. His face changed. He looked away. Sterling did not look at her at all. In the third week, Bartholomew brought his daughter. His daughter was 26. Her name was Caroline. She was the oldest of the grandchildren and the one Adelaide had loved most fiercely, and Caroline knew it, and had never quite been able to bring herself to be cruel to Adelaide the way her father and her aunts had been cruel. Caroline came up the front stairs alone while her father was talking to the painter on the back porch. She found Adelaide in the kitchen. Adelaide was washing a single teacup. Caroline stood in the doorway for a moment. She had a tote bag on her shoulder. Her eyes were red. "Adelaide." Adelaide turned off the water. "I wanted to—" Caroline stopped. She bit the inside of her lip. "I wanted to say I'm sorry." Adelaide dried the teacup with a dish towel. She set the teacup down on the counter. "You don't have anything to be sorry for, sweetheart." "Yes, I do." "No." "I should have—" Caroline shook her head. "I should have said something, Adelaide. When the will was read, I should have said something to my father. I should have—" She did not finish. Adelaide walked across the kitchen. She put her arms around her step-granddaughter. She held her for a long, quiet moment. Then she stepped back, and she put her hands on Caroline's shoulders, and she looked the young woman in the eyes. "Listen to me," Adelaide said. "You owe me nothing. You did not write that will. You did not stand in that conference room. You are not your father, Caroline. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Do you understand me?" "Yes, Adelaide." "All right." Adelaide kissed her on the forehead. And then she went back to the sink, and she picked up the teacup, and she put it in the cupboard, and she closed the cupboard door. Caroline stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she said, "I love you, Della." It was the first time anyone in that family had ever called her Della. Adelaide closed her eyes. She kept her back to the doorway. She nodded once. When she turned around, the kitchen was empty. On the morning of the 30th day, Adelaide woke up before the sun. The house was quiet. She walked through it one last time. She walked through the front parlor where she had served sherry to senators and federal judges, and where Reginald had taught her gently in their first year of marriage how to hold a champagne glass at a reception. She walked through the dining room where the brown chairs that Genevieve had hated still stood. She walked through the library where Reginald had read every evening of his life until the very last evening. She walked up the curving staircase. She walked through the bedroom where she had slept beside him for 40 years and where she had found him cold one Tuesday morning. She walked through the dressing room where his suit still hung, although the children had told her gently, firmly, that the suits were going to a charity auction the following week and that she should not bother with them. She did not cry. She had been waiting for the crying to come for 30 days, and the crying had not come. She wondered now if it ever would. Downstairs in the front hall she had 3 suitcases and 2 cardboard boxes, 1 framed photograph from the mantel, her wedding photograph, the one with the cold kiss from Genevieve frozen forever in the background. She had taken nothing else. The brown envelope from Hollis Pemberton's office was on top of the smallest box. The rusted iron key was inside it. So was the folded note from Reginald, which she had not yet read. She had been afraid to read it. She did not know why. She had thought more than once in the long, sleepless nights of the last month that the note from Reginald was probably one final humiliation, one last small twist of the knife, some sentence in his careful handwriting explaining his reasons, justifying himself, asking her perhaps to forgive him. She did not want to read it, not in the Beacon Hill house, not in the rooms where he had been her husband. She would read it, she had decided, when she got there, if there was a there. At 7:30, the moving men came. They were polite. They did not speak to her unless she spoke to them. They loaded her 3 suitcases and her 2 boxes into the back of her car in less than 20 minutes. At 7:55, Bartholomew arrived. He was early. He had a cup of coffee from a chain cafe in his hand and a key ring with the new locks already on it. "I wanted to be here," he said, "to make sure everything went smoothly." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. She had a great deal she could have said. She did not say any of it. She picked up her purse. She walked past him out the front door. She walked down the granite steps for the last time. She got into the Honda Civic. She put her hands on the wheel. She started the engine. Bartholomew stood in the doorway of the house, watching her. She did not look at him. She put the car in gear. She pulled away from the curb. She drove down Louisburg Square one last time. She turned onto Mount Vernon. She turned onto Charles. She drove across the city she had lived in for 40 years. She drove across the river. She got onto the Mass Pike, and she drove west. She drove west for 2 hours. The city fell behind her. The suburbs fell behind her. The land flattened and rose and opened into hills. Somewhere west of Worcester, the rain stopped. Somewhere west of Springfield, the sun came out. She did not turn on the radio. She did not stop for coffee. She kept driving. And somewhere just east of the exit for Lee, with the Berkshires rising blue in the windshield and the brown envelope on the seat beside her, Adelaide Ashcroft made herself a quiet promise. She did not know what was waiting for her in Cedarbrook. She did not know if it was a roof or a ruin or a final cruelty dressed up as charity. She did not know if there would be water in the pipes or heat in the walls or a single thing inside the house that would make her glad to have come. What she knew was this: she was 68 years old. She had been somebody's wife for 40 years and somebody's secretary for 2 before that. She had been quiet for all of those years. She had been gracious. She had been patient. She had bitten her tongue through 10,000 small cruelties, and she had smiled through 100 large ones, and she had carried herself all that time with the dignity of a woman who believed that dignity in the end would be its own reward. That was over. Whatever waited for her at 47 Oakwood Lane, she was going to walk in through the door of it as a different woman than the one who had walked out of Hollis Pemberton's conference room 30 days before. She had nothing left to lose. She had nothing left to protect. She had nothing left to be afraid of. And in that emptiness, in that long, cold emptiness, behind the wheel of an old Honda on the Mass Pike, with the Berkshires rising in front of her, she felt for the first time in 40 years something she had almost forgotten she could feel. She felt free. The exit for Cedarbrook came up at 20 minutes past noon. She put on her turn signal. She did not know it yet, and she would not know it for several hours more, but the man she had buried 4 weeks earlier had been preparing the road she was about to drive down for 40 years. He had been preparing it in silence. He had been preparing it with patience. He had been preparing it with the same long, careful hands that had drafted the cruelest will in the history of the Boston bar. He had been playing a game that had taken him 40 years to set up. A game that his 3 children, sitting in their charcoal suits in Hollis Pemberton's conference room, had thought they had just won. A game that they had not, in fact, even begun to understand they were playing. The exit ramp curved down through a stand of pine trees and emptied out onto a 2-lane country road. Adelaide Ashcroft turned right, and she drove west into the hills with the rusted key in the envelope on the seat beside her, and the rest of her life waiting in absolute silence at the end of a dirt road she had never heard of. The road into Cedarbrook ran along the bottom of a long, shallow valley, pine on the left, a creek on the right, a low stone wall gray with moss following the creek, the kind of wall a man builds 1 stone at a time over a lifetime without ever finishing. Adelaide drove with the windows down. She had not driven with the windows down in a long time. Reginald had not liked it. Reginald had said the wind ruined a woman's hair. Reginald had said many small things over the years that she had absorbed the way a sponge absorbs water until she had stopped noticing she was absorbing them at all. The wind in the Honda Civic that afternoon had the smell of pine sap in it, and cold creek water, and somewhere underneath the smell of wood smoke from a chimney she could not yet see, the town came up around a bend. Cedarbrook. She had been picturing in the back of her mind the kind of town that Genevieve's voice had implied. Some forgotten little spot, a few sad buildings, boarded windows, the kind of town a man left behind on his way somewhere else. It was not that. The main street was short, maybe a quarter of a mile, but every building on it was alive. There was a hardware store with a green awning and a wooden bench out front, a bakery with white curtains and a sign that read, "Fresh bread at noon." A small library in a stone building that had clearly once been a schoolhouse, a church with a white steeple, a diner with a row of pickup trucks parked in front of it, a general store with 2 gas pumps and a porch. She drove slowly down the middle of it, and the strangest thing happened. The first man she passed, a man in a barn coat sweeping the sidewalk in front of the hardware store, looked up at her car. He stopped sweeping. He raised one hand in the slow, careful way a man raises a hand to a person he has been expecting. She did not know him. She nodded back automatically the way a polite woman nods. She kept driving. 2 doors down in front of the bakery, a woman with a tray of fresh loaves paused on her way back inside. She turned. She looked at the Honda. She watched it go past with an expression on her face that Adelaide could not name. Not curiosity, not surprise. Something more settled than that. Something that had been settled for a long time. Outside the diner, 3 old men in caps were sitting on a bench, drinking coffee out of paper cups. All 3 of them turned their heads as she drove by. One of them, a man with a white mustache and a Red Sox cap, touched the brim of his cap. It was a small gesture. It was the kind of gesture men of his generation reserved for funerals and weddings, and women they had known a long time. Adelaide kept her hands on the wheel. She did not understand what was happening. She told herself she was imagining it. Small towns are like this. Strangers stand out. People look. It does not mean anything. But by the time she reached the general store at the far end of Main Street, she had been nodded at, waved at, or otherwise acknowledged by 9 different people, none of whom she had ever seen before in her life. She pulled into the gravel lot in front of the general store. She turned off the engine. She sat in the car for a long moment with her hands still on the wheel. The store was a low wooden building with a wide front porch. A hand-lettered sign in the window read, "Doyle's Mercantile." A black dog was sleeping on the porch in a square of sunlight. The screen door had a brass bell hanging from a leather strap. Adelaide picked up the brown envelope from the passenger seat. She looked at it. She put it down again. She got out of the car. The bell on the screen door rang when she opened it. The store was exactly the kind of store you would want it to be. Wide plank floors worn smooth by a century of boots, shelves of canned goods and dry goods, a long counter at the back with a brass cash register that looked like it had been bought during the Eisenhower administration, the smell of coffee and wood smoke and old leather. There was a woman behind the counter. She was perhaps 75, tall, thin, iron gray hair pulled back into a long braid down her back. She wore a denim work shirt and a canvas apron with a pencil in the pocket. Her hands on the counter were the hands of a woman who had carried a great many things in her life. She looked up when the bell rang. She looked at Adelaide. She did not say hello. She did not ask if she could help. She set down the pencil she had been holding. She walked around the end of the counter slowly, with the slight stiffness of an old hip. She walked across the wide plank floor. She stopped 2 feet in front of Adelaide. She looked into Adelaide's face for a long moment. Then she said in a voice that was very quiet, very steady, and very certain, "You're Della." Adelaide did not move. She had not been called Della in 40 years. She had not been called Della since she had stood in her father's kitchen in Dorchester on the morning of her wedding, and her mother had pinned a piece of borrowed lace into her hair and said, "You look beautiful, Della. He's a lucky man." Della. The name had died that day. It had died in the hush of the Beacon Hill house. It had died in the word Adelaide said politely by people who would never know her for 40 years. She felt her throat close. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, that's what my parents called me." The old woman nodded once. She did not smile. She did not embrace her. She simply looked at Adelaide for another long moment with a kind of quiet attention that Adelaide had not been looked at with in years, and then she said, "My name is Winifred Doyle. People here call me Winnie. Reginald told us a long time ago that you would come. He said to watch for a woman in an older Honda. He said she'd be tired. He said she'd be alone. He said her name was Della." Adelaide reached out. Her hand found the edge of a wooden barrel of crackers. She held on to it. "I'm sorry," she said. You don't have to." The old woman's voice was kind, the kind of kind that does not perform itself. "Sit down, Della. Sit down for a minute. I'm going to put on the kettle, and then I'm going to walk you down the road to your house. The key is in your bag. There's bread in the kitchen. The pilot light is lit. The water's been running clear since Tuesday." Adelaide stared at her. "My house." Winnie Doyle nodded. "Your house, Della." He kept it ready. For 40 years. It took 20 minutes and a cup of black tea so strong it stained the inside of the cup before Adelaide could trust her legs to walk again. Winnie did not press her. Winnie sat across from her at a small wooden table near the wood stove and drank her own tea in silence. She did not ask questions. She did not offer explanations. She did not offer condolences. When Adelaide finally stood up, her cup was empty, and her hands were steady, and the worst of the trembling in her chest had eased into a low, quiet hum. Winnie pulled on a jacket. "I'll walk you down." "You don't have to." "I want to." They walked out together, down the steps of the general store, across the gravel lot, to Adelaide's car. Winnie sat in the passenger seat without being asked. She buckled her seat belt. She gestured down the road with one weathered hand. "Drive on past the church. The road bends. There's a turn-off on the right. It's not marked. There used to be a wooden post, but the post fell over some years back, and your husband never got around to putting up a new one. He liked it that way. He used to say the people who needed to find the place would find it." Adelaide drove. The road bent. The unmarked turnoff appeared exactly where Winnie had said it would. A narrow break in the trees, a dirt track running off into a corridor of old-growth oak. Adelaide eased the Honda onto it. The pavement gave way to packed earth. The earth gave way to ruts. The ruts ran between trees that had to be 200 years old. Their branches met overhead and made a long green tunnel, and the afternoon sunlight came through the leaves in shifting patterns that moved across the windshield like something living. She drove for almost a mile. She did not speak. Winnie did not speak either. And then the trees fell away, and they came out into a wide clearing. Adelaide stopped the car. She did not mean to stop the car. Her foot stopped the car for her. The clearing was perhaps 3 acres across. In the middle of it stood a house. Stone, 2 stories, a steep slate roof, leaded glass windows in heavy wooden frames painted white, a small covered portico over the front door supported by carved oak posts that had gone gray with weather. Ivy climbing up the western wall, not the wild choking ivy of an abandoned place, but the careful, trained ivy of a place that has been loved. There was a garden, or what had once been a garden and was on its way back to being a garden. Stone paths half overgrown but still legible. Flower beds that had been laid out in the formal English style now tangled and wild but still alive. Roses blooming red and white in messy abundance against the gray stone of the walls. A small dry stone fountain in the center of what had once been a herb garden. Behind the house, and this was the part Adelaide could not at first take, inland rose into low hills, all of it forested, all of it, the dense old hardwood of the Berkshires, and all of it, every tree of it was hers. She would learn later that the property was 247 acres. She did not know that yet. She knew only that she was looking at something that did not match a single word Genevieve had said. It was not a falling down house. It was not an old place not worth the property taxes. It was not the sort of property a man inherited from a great uncle and never bothered to maintain. It was beautiful. It was beautiful in the way that certain old houses are beautiful, patiently, stubbornly, with a kind of dignity that does not shout. Adelaide put both hands on the steering wheel. She closed her eyes. She breathed in. She breathed out. When she opened her eyes again, Winnie was watching her. "He came up here once a month," Winnie said quietly. "For 40 years, sometimes more. He worked in the gardens. He cleaned the gutters. He fixed the porch railing the year there was the bad ice. He patched the roof himself twice, once in 1997 and once in 2014. Adelaide did not move. "He told us the first time he came into my store in the summer of 1984, Winnie went on, that he had a wife back in Boston. He said her name was Della. He said he loved her more than anything else in his life, and he said that if he ever died, she might come up here someday. He asked us to be ready when she came." Adelaide could not speak. "That was my mother's store then," Winnie said. "I was 35 years old. I helped my mother run it. Reginald sat at our kitchen table that summer and drank our coffee and told us about you for 2 hours, about how you typed faster than any secretary he had ever had, about how you laughed, about a dress you wore the first time he took you to dinner, about the way you held a teacup." Adelaide put her face in her hands. She did not weep, not yet, but she made a small sound, a small low sound that she did not know was inside her. Winnie reached across the console. She put her old strong hand on Adelaide's shoulder. She left it there. "He kept you a secret from them, Della," she said. "I don't know what he told you about why he did it. I don't know if he ever told you anything, but he kept you a secret from his children, and he kept this house a secret from his children, and he kept all of it ready for 40 years, because he was waiting for this day." Adelaide lowered her hands. For this day. The day they took the rest and left you what mattered. The front door was unlocked. Winnie said it almost shyly on the steps of the portico as Adelaide stood with the rusted iron key in her trembling hand. "He never locked it. He used to say there was nothing inside that anyone in Cedarbrook would steal, and if someone needed shelter, well, he wanted them to be able to walk in." Adelaide hesitated. She had carried the key for 31 days. She had thought more than once in the long, sleepless nights of the last month about this moment, about the turning of a key in a lock, about the small mechanical act that would mark the line between the life she had lost and the life she did not yet know. But there was no lock to turn. She put the key in her pocket. She put her hand on the iron handle. She pushed. The heavy oak door swung inward, slowly, quietly, on hinges that had been oiled within the last 6 months. Adelaide stepped across the threshold, and she stopped. And she stood there at the edge of a worn rag rug in a stone-walled foyer, with her old leather purse in one hand and the wedding photograph in a wooden frame under her other arm. And she looked at what Reginald Ashcroft had spent 40 years building in secret. The room ahead of her was the long main room of the house, wide plank floors. The kind of plank floors that have been walked on for 200 years and have absorbed every step. A massive stone fireplace at the far end. A mantel made from a single piece of black oak, hand-adzed dark with age. A pair of leather chairs in front of the fireplace. A worn rug between them. A small table with a kerosene lamp. A bookshelf along one wall, floor to ceiling, packed with books in cracked leather bindings and faded cloth covers. The room was simple. The room was honest. The room was the room of a man who had wanted to be quiet. But it was not the room that stopped Adelaide. What stopped Adelaide were the photographs. There were photographs everywhere. On the mantel above the fireplace, on the small table beside the kerosene lamp, on the window sills of the leaded glass windows, on the bookshelf between the books propped against the spines, on the wall above the leather chairs, on the wall beside the front door, on the wall going up the staircase, in the hallway leading back toward the kitchen, dozens of them, maybe 100, maybe more, and every single one of them was a photograph of her. Adelaide walked slowly across the wide plank floor. She stopped at the mantel. The photograph in the center was the wedding photograph, the same one she was carrying framed under her arm. It had been printed in black and white and matted and put in a heavy wooden frame. In the picture, she was 28 years old. She was laughing. She had not remembered for many years that she had laughed at her wedding. To the right of the wedding photograph in a smaller frame was a picture she did not remember being taken at all. She was kneeling in the herb garden of the Beacon Hill house. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows. There was dirt on her hands. Her hair was coming out of its clip. She was looking up at someone at Reginald, she knew, because there was no one else who had ever taken pictures of her, and she was smiling. Not the social smile, the real one. The smile that happened on her face about 3 times a year and that no one in the Beacon Hill house had ever seen. She did not know how he had taken the picture. She did not remember the camera. To the left of the wedding photograph was another one she did not remember. She was sitting in the window seat of the library in the Beacon Hill house. She had a book open in her lap. The afternoon light was on her face. She was not looking at the camera. She was not looking at anything. She was in the photograph, simply existing peacefully in a moment she had not known she would ever look back on. The photograph had been taken by the look of her hair, perhaps in the late 90s. She had been 43. She was beautiful. Adelaide had not for many years allowed herself to think the word beautiful in connection with herself. She moved to the next photograph, and the next. Della at 50, asleep on a wicker chaise on the back porch of the Beacon Hill house, her hands folded on her stomach, her face turned toward the sun. Della at 55, reading the newspaper at the breakfast table. Della at 60 in a navy blue dress on her way out the door to a charity gala. She had not known the picture was being taken. She had been adjusting an earring. Her face was the face of a woman who did not yet know she was being looked at and who was in that moment at her unguarded best. Della in 1992 in a sun hat in the garden in Falmouth. Della in 2005 with a glass of red wine in her hand, laughing at something Reginald had said. Della, Della, Della. 40 years of her frozen on a stranger's wall in a house she had never known existed, taken by a husband she had thought she understood. She walked the length of the long main room. She walked up the staircase. The staircase had photographs running up the wall. Della at 30, Della at 35, Della at 40, The bedroom at the top of the stairs had more photographs. Above the bed, on the dresser, on the small table by the window where someone had left a book, face down 3 pages from the end. Adelaide stood in the doorway of that bedroom for a long time. The bed was made. The pillows had been freshly fluffed. The blanket folded back at the corner the way Reginald had always folded back the corner for her on cold nights in case she was cold. She did not go into the bedroom. She was not ready. She came back down the stairs, slowly, carefully, holding the railing. In the long main room, Winnie was waiting. Winnie had not moved from the threshold of the front door. Winnie was watching Adelaide with the kind of patient, weathered attention that some old people have when they are watching something happen that they have been waiting their whole lives to see. He used to call this place the sanctuary, Winnie said quietly. Adelaide could not speak. He told me once, Winnie went on, that every man should have one place in his life where he is allowed to love the woman he loves out loud. He said in Boston he could not. He said in Boston the world he lived in was a world where love had to be quiet, where it had to be polite, where it had to fit into the spaces his children and his profession allowed it to fit into. Winnie's voice was very soft. He said this house was the place he was allowed to be loud. Adelaide put her hand on the back of one of the leather chairs. She held herself up. Winnie watched her for a moment longer. Then she crossed the room in her steady old woman way, and she stopped in front of Adelaide. She reached up, and she touched Adelaide's cheek with the back of her hand, the way a sister touches a sister. "There's a study," Winnie said, "under the staircase. There's a door there you might not have noticed. He left something for you in it. A letter, written in his hand, sealed with wax. He told me the last time I saw him in October that you were to read it before you did anything else." Adelaide nodded. "I'll go now," Winnie said. "You don't have to. You should be alone to read it." Winnie picked up her jacket from the back of the chair where she had laid it. She paused at the door. She turned. "Della." "Yes." "He loved you. He was a flawed man. He was in some ways a coward. But he loved you, and he loved you in a way that cost him. And he loved you for 40 years without being able to say it where the people who hurt you could hear him. Whatever you think of him when this is over, I want you to know that part." She looked at Adelaide for one more long, quiet moment. Then she let herself out. The screen door of the portico swung shut behind her. The latch clicked, and Adelaide Ashcroft stood alone for the first time in the secret house of her life. The door under the staircase was almost invisible. It was paneled to match the wainscoting. It had no knob, only a small brass keyhole and a recessed iron pull that you had to know was there to find. Adelaide found it. She pressed her thumb against the iron pull. The door clicked open. The room behind it was small, maybe 10 feet by 12. No windows. The walls on 3 sides were lined floor to ceiling with built-in mahogany shelves. The shelves were not full of books. They were full of file folders, hundreds of them, standing upright, each one labeled in a precise handwriting she would have known anywhere with a name and a date and a brief subject line. She did not look at the labels. Not yet. The fourth wall held a heavy mahogany desk, a green-shaded banker's lamp on a brass base, a leather chair worn dark and shiny at the arms by 40 years of one man's elbows, a blotter stained with ink set squarely in the center of the desk, and on the blotter set deliberately, with the kind of precise placement Reginald Ashcroft had brought to every piece of paper he had ever touched in his professional life a cream-colored envelope, heavy paper, sealed with red wax. On the front, in black ink in his careful, sloping hand, "For my Della." Adelaide sat down in the leather chair. She picked up the envelope. She held it for a long moment in both hands. The wax was dark and slightly chipped at one edge. He had pressed it with the small brass seal he kept in his desk in Boston, the seal that had a single oak tree on it, the seal he had used once on a Christmas card he had given her in 1989, on which he had written in the same careful hand, "To my dearest. There is no oak in any forest that does not lean toward the light it loves." She had kept that card in a drawer for 35 years. She had not known what it meant. She broke the seal. She unfolded the pages. There were 5 of them, onion skin paper, black ink, the handwriting of a man who had been a careful writer all his life. She read, "My dearest Della, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have found the sanctuary, and you are sitting in the chair I have sat in the room I built for you, with my hand still on the page in front of you, even though my hand is no longer in this world. I am sorry, my Della. I am sorry that I had to do it this way. I want you to understand. I want you to understand from the beginning, because if you understand from the beginning, the rest of what is in this house will make sense to you, and you will be able to use it the way I have prepared it for you to use it. So let me start. In the spring of 1984, I had been a widower for 6 years. My 3 children were nearly grown. I was running the firm. I was by every external measure a successful man. I was also at that time in my life the loneliest man I had ever known. You walked into my office that May. You did not see me at first. You sat down at the typewriter in the secretarial pool, and you typed motions, and I stood in the doorway of my office and watched you, and I knew before the end of that first afternoon that I had been waiting for you for 58 years. I do not know how you knew these things, Della, but I knew. I asked you to dinner. You said yes. We were married in November, and on the morning after our wedding, my children, my 3 children, Bartholomew and Genevieve and Sterling, sat down with me in the parlor of the Beacon Hill house, and they told me what they had decided. They had decided that you were a mistake. They had decided that they would tolerate you because they had to, but that they would never accept you. They told me that morning that if I attempted to leave you any meaningful share of the family estate, they would contest the will. They would tie the estate up in litigation for years. They would drag your name through the Boston papers. They were 20 and 18 and 16. And they told me this in voices like ice. I sat across from them, Della, that morning, and I understood for the first time who my children were. I had a choice to make. I could fight them in the open. I could change my will publicly, leave you the house and the practice and the bulk of the estate, and let them go to war. I could spend the next 40 years in a knife fight with my own children, with you in the middle of it. Or I could be patient. Della, I chose patience. I chose on the morning after our wedding to play a game that would take 40 years to set up, a game my children would not even know they were in until the moment decades later when they would walk into Hollis Pemberton's conference room and think they had won. Adelaide stopped reading. She looked up. The lamp on the desk made a small green pool of light around her hands. Beyond the lamp, the file folders on the shelves stretched away into shadow. She did not yet know what was in those folders. She had a feeling, a small, certain feeling beginning to gather in her chest that she was about to find out. She turned the page. 3 months after our wedding, my uncle Cornelius died. He had been my mother's brother, a bachelor, a historian at Williams College. He lived alone all his life in a stone house in the Berkshires that had been in our family since 1827. When his will was read in May of 1985, I learned that he had left me everything. The house, the land, 247 acres of old hardwood forest, the contents of the house, and a substantial amount of money in cash and in securities that he had spent 50 years accumulating quietly, the way certain old bachelors accumulate quietly when they have nothing else to spend it on. He left me a single instruction. It was written in his hand on a piece of paper that the executor handed me in a sealed envelope. The instruction was this: Reginald, protect this place for someone you love more than your own life. It deserves to shelter love, not greed. Cornelius had had a niece, my cousin Irene, who had spent 30 years trying to get the house away from him through every legal avenue available to her. She had hired lawyers. She had made him sit through psychiatric evaluations. She had once, when he was 80, sent the police to perform a wellness check in the hope that he would be declared incompetent. He had hated her for it. He had died in February of 1985 with the deeds to the house in his desk drawer and a single letter to me on top of them. Della. He had given me the way out. He had given me 3 months into my marriage the perfect place to hide what I most wanted to protect. So I hid it. I deeded the house and the land to you in your sole name in June of 1985 as a gift, outside of the marital estate, untouchable by Massachusetts law by anyone other than you. I established a trust to maintain it, funded out of Cornelius's bequest, large enough to cover all property taxes, utilities, and maintenance for 50 years. The trust is still in place. You will never have to pay for this house. It will stand exactly as it stands now until 2035 at minimum, without you spending $1. I told no one. I did not tell my partners. I did not tell my children. I did not tell my own attorney, except for Hollis Pemberton, whom I trusted with my life and who set up the trust under conditions of absolute confidentiality. And I did not tell you, Della. I am sorry. I am so sorry. But understand, if I had told you, you would have come to me one day in some moment of difficulty, and you would have asked me about it. And my children would have heard. They were always listening. They had me followed twice in the early years. I caught both detectives. They tapped my office phone in 1991. I had the line swept and a man arrested. They were watching Della. They were watching for 40 years. And so I came up here alone. Once a month, sometimes more. I worked on the house. I planted gardens for the woman I could not bring openly to my own dinner table. I took photographs of you in the Beacon Hill house, in the gardens, in the windows, in the small, unwatched moments of your life, and I brought them up here and I framed them and I hung them on the walls, so that this house at least could love you out loud. And I waited. I waited for the day when I would be gone, and the will would be sealed, and the law would have spoken, and the case would be closed before my children even understood there had been a case at all. That day has come. You are reading this letter, which means I am dead, which means it has worked. Adelaide closed her eyes. The chair held her. The room held her. The 40 years of her marriage, every weekend trip, every Cedar Brook receipt, every small unsigned sketch of a stone wall, every silence she had not asked about turned very slowly, very gently, like a great wheel turning under water, and arranged itself into a different shape. She had not been excluded. She had been protected. She opened her eyes. She turned the page. What I have done in the will is a gift, Della, even though it does not look like a gift. I want to explain it to you carefully because once you understand it, you will not be afraid. The Beacon Hill house, which I have left to my 3 children, is mortgaged, heavily. I took out a substantial loan against the property in 2022. The proceeds went into the maintenance trust for this house and into a discretionary fund I have left for you separate from the will, which Hollis Pemberton will explain to you in due course. The Beacon Hill house, when my children attempt to sell it, will need to clear that mortgage before they see a dime. The mortgage with interest and penalties will absorb most of the equity. In addition, I placed historic preservation easements on the property in 2018. These easements significantly restrict any renovations or modifications. The interior designer, my daughter is no doubt already paying, will discover when permits are sought that the house cannot be altered. The wallpaper she wants to take down is protected. The brown chairs she has always hated cannot, by the terms of the easement, be removed from the dining room without state approval. The investment accounts I have left to my children are held in trusts. Each trust has conditions. Bartholomew's trust requires for distributions continuous employment, verifiable by tax returns, and the passage of an annual character evaluation by an independent trustee, a retired federal judge named Ellsworth Granby, whom I appointed 3 years ago, and who is a man of unimpeachable integrity. Bartholomew has not held continuous employment in the strict sense the trust defines since 2019. He will discover this in the spring. Genevieve's trust requires the maintenance of stable family relationships, defined by no fewer than 4 scheduled annual visits to her own children, attested by affidavit. As you and I both know, my Della Genevieve has not spoken to her oldest son in 9 years. The trust will not pay her anything in any meaningful amount until that changes. Sterling's trust is structured as a business investment vehicle requiring his active personal management. If he does not manage the investments himself, and Sterling has never managed anything in his life, the principal automatically dissolves and is donated on December 31st of the 7th year to a charity of my choosing. I gave them, Della, exactly what they wanted, in exactly the way that will make them most miserable. I would like to tell you that I did this out of nobler motives. I would like to tell you that I have done it for justice or for ethics or for some grand principle. The truth is simpler. I did it for you. I did it because for 40 years I watched you smile through their cruelty. I watched you bake their birthday cakes. I watched you sew the buttons on their coats. I watched you rise every morning in a house that did not love you back and try anyway. And I never stood up for you, Della. Not once. Not in the open. Not where anyone could hear. I was a coward. I have been a coward all my life. This house, this letter, this long, quiet game, this is the only courage I had to give you. It is a poor courage. It comes too late, but it is yours. All of it. And it is enough, my Della. It is enough to give you what they have taken from you, and more besides, and I want you to use it without guilt, and without grief, and without one moment of wondering whether you deserve it. You deserve all of it. You deserved more than I ever gave you in life. I love you. forever, always. Reginald. Adelaide put the letter down on the blotter. She put her hands flat on the desk. She closed her eyes, and the crying that had been waiting inside her for 31 days finally slowly came. It was not loud crying. It was not the kind of crying you do at a funeral. It was older than that. It was the kind of crying a woman does when 40 years of held breath finally lets go. The kind of crying that comes out of a place she has been guarding so carefully for so long that she has forgotten until that very moment that the place was there at all. She cried for a long time. When she stopped, the green-shaded lamp was the only light in the room, and the afternoon outside the house had gone over into evening. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She picked up the letter. She read it again, and then a third time. And on the third reading, somewhere on the second page, she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been broken for 31 days began very quietly to set. The phone in the front hall rang at 6:30. Adelaide had not known there was a phone in the front hall. It was an old rotary phone on a small wooden stand under one of the leaded glass windows, and she had walked past it 3 times without seeing it. It rang now with the heavy mechanical bell of a phone made before 1980, and the sound of it in the empty stone house was so startling that she nearly dropped her teacup. She picked up the receiver. "Hello." "Adelaide, it's Hollis Pemberton." She closed her eyes. She sank down onto the small wooden stool beside the phone. "Hollis, I am calling my dear because I felt you should hear this from me before you heard it from anyone else. Bartholomew called my office an hour ago. He has retained new counsel, a firm out of Hartford. They are filing a motion in probate court tomorrow morning. A motion to contest the deed transfer of the Cedarbrook property. They are arguing that the property, although deeded to you in 1985, should be treated as a marital asset subject to division. They are seeking to compel the sale of the house and the division of all proceeds, with 3/4 going to my client's 3 children. Adelaide did not move. "Adelaide, I want to tell you very clearly. They will not win. The deed is 40 years old. It is bulletproof. Reginald and I drafted it in such a way that it cannot be successfully challenged." "All right, but it is going to be ugly. They have hired aggressive people. They have unlimited funds, at least until the mortgage forecloses on the Beacon Hill house, which will not be soon enough to spare you. There will be depositions. There may be a hearing. They will come at you, Adelaide. They will come at you with everything they have." Adelaide opened her eyes. The lamp from the study was throwing a long line of green light down the hall. The photographs on the wall going up the staircase, the photographs of her at every age she had been, were all looking down at the small woman on the stool beside the phone. "Hollis." "Yes, my dear." "Reginald left a letter, in the study here." "I know. I helped him write it. He says there are files." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Hollis Pemberton spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Yes," he said. "He told me about the files. I never saw them. He kept them in Cedarbrook for that reason. He told me the last time I saw him that they would be on the shelves of the study, that they were organized by name, and that you should not under any circumstances read them until you were ready to use them." "What is in them, Hollis?" "Adelaide, I do not know exactly. I know in general. Your husband was a careful man. He spent 50 years as a litigator at the highest level of the Boston bar, and along the way he came into possession of a great deal of information about a great many people. He never used any of it. He told me more than once that information was a thing you kept in case you needed to protect someone you loved." and the people on those shelves. From what he told me, my dear, there are folders for many people: senators, judges, business partners, old clients. He hesitated. And there are folders, I am told, for your 3 stepchildren. Adelaide sat very still. Adelaide. Yes, Hollis. Read the folders for the 3 children. Read them carefully. Do not act on anything yet. Call me before you act, but read them, and know what you have. All right. He spent 40 years preparing this house for you. He spent 40 years preparing the will, and he spent 40 years, my dear, preparing you a weapon. Do not let yourself forget that. He paused. Are you all right, Adelaide? She looked for a long moment at the line of green light from the study. Hollis, she said. Yes. I have not been all right for a very long time, but I think I am about to be. She hung up the receiver. She stood up. She walked back across the long main room, past the leather chairs, past the fireplace, past the wedding photograph on the mantel. She walked into the small mahogany-walled study. She sat down at the desk. She turned in the leather chair, and she looked at the wall of file folders. There were hundreds of them, each one labeled in Reginald's careful, sloping hand. Names and dates and brief subjects. The shelves rose all the way to the ceiling. They had been organized alphabetically with the patience of a man who had spent 40 years knowing this moment would eventually come. Her eyes moved across the labels. Her eyes stopped on the 3rd shelf from the top. She stood up. She walked across the small room. She raised her hand. Her fingers, the same fingers that had typed motions for Reginald Ashcroft in May of 1984, rested on the spine of a folder. The label in his hand read, Bartholomew Ashcroft, Real Estate Transactions, 2017 through 2023. Adelaide stared at it for a long moment. Then she pulled the folder slowly off the shelf. She carried it back to the desk. She sat down. She set it on the blotter beside the letter from her husband, and beside the rusted iron key that had brought her to this room, and beside the empty teacup that Winnie had filled for her 4 hours earlier in the kitchen of the general store. She opened the folder. She began to read. The folder was 3/4 of an inch thick. It was bound at the top with a brass paper fastener. The pages inside had been arranged by Reginald in the way Reginald had arranged everything in his life chronologically, with cross-references in the margin in red pencil, and with a 1-page summary at the front, typed on his own typewriter, single-spaced, dated, and signed in blue ink at the bottom of the last paragraph. Adelaide read the summary first. She read it 3 times. By the 3rd reading, her hands were no longer shaking. They had passed through shaking and out the other side into the kind of stillness a hand goes into when it is preparing to do something it has never done before. The summary described in plain language a pattern of real estate transactions Bartholomew Ashcroft had executed between 2017 and 2023. 11 properties, all in the greater Boston area, all bought through shell entities Bartholomew controlled, all sold within 12 to 14 months to other entities Bartholomew also controlled at prices that had been deliberately suppressed in order to qualify each property for tax abatements that did not in fact apply. The total amount of state and federal tax that had been evaded by Reginald's careful calculation was $4.1 million. The summary noted in Reginald's typed prose that the documentation in the folder behind it included copies of every transfer deed, every tax filing, every false declaration of property condition, and the names of 3 accountants who had signed off on documents they could not legally have signed off on, and who had been paid off the books in amounts Reginald had also documented. At the bottom of the summary in blue ink in his careful hand, Reginald had written, "This information is true and complete to the best of my knowledge. It was assembled in the ordinary course of my professional review of family financial matters. It is provided to my wife Adelaide for her use as she sees fit in any legal proceeding in which it may become relevant. R.A." Adelaide closed the folder. She sat very still. She had been married for 40 years to a man whose office she had walked past 10,000 times without ever opening the door. She had thought she had known him. She had thought she had known the limits of him. She closed her eyes in the green pool of light at the desk, and she understood for the first time that the limits she had assigned to her husband had been the limits she had assigned to herself. That the small, quiet attorney who had brought her tea every morning and never raised his voice and slept beside her for 40 years had been the entire time a man capable of patience that she had not been able to imagine. She had not been able to imagine it because no one had ever shown her that kind of patience. Until now. She opened her eyes. She stood up. She walked back to the wall of folders. She read the labels. She found on the next shelf down 2 more folders. Genevieve Ashcroft Halloway. Asset Concealment in Marital Dissolution Proceedings. 2008 through 2021. Sterling Ashcroft. Corporate Accounting Irregularities. 2014 through 2023. She pulled them both off the shelf. She carried them back to the desk. She read them one after the other in the green pool of light while the night came down outside the leaded glass windows and the silence of the Berkshire Hills rose up around the house. Genevieve's folder was thinner than Bartholomew's, but what it contained was in some ways worse. 3 divorces, 3 financial settlements. In each one, Genevieve had concealed substantial assets from the man she was divorcing. 2 of those men had been good men. One of them had been broken financially by the settlement because Genevieve's lawyers had argued successfully that he was the wealthier party, when in fact, by Reginald's documentation, the opposite had been true. The man had moved to Florida. He had remarried briefly. He had died of a heart attack in 2016 at the age of 63 in a 1-bedroom apartment Genevieve had once stood in the doorway of and refused to enter. Sterling's folder was the thickest of the 3. Sterling's company, a small private equity firm Reginald had funded for him in 2014, had been routing client funds through a side entity that did not exist on any of its filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The numbers were not enormous. Reginald had calculated the total exposure at perhaps $18 million. But the pattern was deliberate. The pattern was multi-year. The pattern was the kind of pattern that if a federal prosecutor ever happened to look at it would result in indictments. Adelaide read all 3 folders twice. She closed the 3rd one. She set it on top of the other 2. She put her hand flat on the stack. The clock on the desk read 3:14 in the morning. She had been reading for nearly 9 hours. She did not feel tired. She felt in some long, quiet way that she had not felt since she was a young woman awake. The motion came down from the Hartford firm on the morning of the 4th day. It was filed in Suffolk County Probate Court. It alleged in 26 pages of careful argument that the Cedar Brook property had been a marital asset despite being deeded to Adelaide alone in 1985 on the grounds that Reginald had used marital funds to maintain it for 40 years. The petition sought to compel the sale of the property and the division of all proceeds, with 3/4 going to Bartholomew, Genevieve, and Sterling. Hollis Pemberton called Adelaide at 8:15. He read her the relevant paragraphs over the phone. "They are going to depose you, Adelaide," he said. "They will try to make you look confused. They will try to make you look greedy. They will ask you under oath when you first knew about the existence of the Cedar Brook property. They will ask you about your husband's weekend trips. They will ask you, in 100 small, humiliating ways, whether you ever suspected him of an affair. All right. You will tell the truth. Yes. Adelaide. Yes, Hollis. You will not need the folders. Not for this. The deed will hold. The trust will hold. The will is bulletproof. They are filing this to bleed you, not because they think they can win." She looked through the leaded glass window of the kitchen at the morning light on the gardens, the frost on the herbs, the white breath of her own coffee in the cold air of the kitchen. "I understand," she said. She did not need the folders. Not for this, but she kept the folders very close. The deposition was scheduled for the second Tuesday of June. It was held in a conference room in a glass tower on State Street, 4 floors above the office Reginald had worked in for 50 years. The Hartford firm sent 2 attorneys. They were both men in their 40s. They wore the suits men in their 40s wear when they want to be taken for men in their 50s. Adelaide arrived 20 minutes early. She wore a navy blue dress. She wore the pearl earrings Reginald had given her on their 20th anniversary. Hollis Pemberton sat at her right hand at the long polished table. A young associate from Hollis's firm sat beside him. The court reporter set up her stenograph at the head of the table. The 2 Hartford attorneys came in. The older of the 2, a heavy-set man with silver hair, did not introduce himself. He sat down across from Adelaide. He opened his portfolio. He arranged his pens. He looked up at her. He smiled. The smile was the smile of a man who had been told by Bartholomew Ashcroft that the woman across from him was a 68-year-old former secretary who had cried at the reading of her husband's will and would very probably cry again before lunch. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "thank you for being here today. I am going to ask you a series of questions. Please answer to the best of your ability. If you do not understand a question, please tell me. If you need to take a break, please tell me. We are not going to rush you." Adelaide nodded once. She folded her hands on the table. She looked into the middle distance the way Reginald had taught her in 1986 to look at hostile witnesses. She did not smile back. The deposition lasted 4 hours. The Hartford attorney asked her every question he had been instructed to ask. He asked her with great care about her husband's weekend trips. He asked her with great care when she had first suspected that he was hiding the existence of a second property. He asked her with great care about the receipt she had once found in the pocket of a gym bag in 2003. She answered each question. She answered each question simply, truthfully, without elaboration. She did not cry. She did not become flustered. She did not at any point in 4 hours give the man across the table a single piece of testimony he could use. By the 3rd hour, the older attorney had stopped smiling. By the 4th hour, the younger attorney was checking his watch. When the deposition was finally over, the older attorney closed his portfolio. He capped his pens. He stood up. He extended his hand across the table. "Mrs. Ashcroft." She looked at his hand. She did not take it. She looked up into his face. "My husband used to tell me," she said quietly, "that the witnesses he respected most were the ones who told the truth and added nothing. I added nothing today, sir. I did not need to. The older attorney withdrew his hand. He nodded once with the professional courtesy of a man who has just lost a round. He walked out. Hollis Pemberton beside her did not say a word for a long moment. Then he turned to Adelaide. He took her hand in both of his. He did not have to say what he was thinking. His eyes said it for him. The motion in probate court was denied 4 weeks later. The judge wrote a short opinion. The opinion was 11 pages. It found that the deed transfer of 1985 was valid, that the Cedar Brook property was Adelaide Ashcroft's separate property, and that the children's claim on it had no legal basis whatever. The opinion noted in a footnote that Hollis Pemberton would later read aloud to Adelaide on the phone that the petitioners had failed to introduce a single piece of evidence supporting their allegation of marital commingling despite 40 years over which to have done so. The Hartford firm withdrew from the case. Adelaide thought for one quiet morning in her kitchen that it was over. She was wrong. The second motion came on a Friday afternoon in July. Genevieve had filed it alone through a different firm, a boutique firm in Cambridge that specialized in elder law and probate disputes. The motion sought a posthumous evaluation of Reginald Ashcroft's testamentary capacity at the time the will had been written. It alleged that Reginald at the age of 83 had been suffering from cognitive decline. It alleged that he had been unduly influenced. It alleged that the disposition of the will in its peculiar combination of public dismissiveness toward Adelaide and the secret reservation of an unusual property to her name was prima facie evidence of impaired judgment. The motion sought to invalidate the will entirely. Hollis Pemberton called Adelaide at 3. Adelaide, they are not trying to win this one either. They are trying to drag this out. They know the motion will fail. They want to make you defend it. I understand. They will subpoena you again. I understand. They will subpoena Reginald's medical records. They will subpoena his colleagues. They will subpoena me. They will try to find any one person in his last 5 years who ever saw him forget a name or repeat a story or struggle with a phone number. And will they find anyone? My dear, he was 83 years old. Of course they will find someone. She nodded into the phone. Hollis. Yes. Can I take the stand? There was a long pause. Adelaide, you do not have to take the stand. The will speaks for itself. The medical records speak for themselves. Reginald's law partners will speak for themselves. You do not have to. Hollis, can I take the stand? Another pause. Yes, he said. If you wish to, yes. Then put me on it. Adelaide, I have been quiet for 40 years, Hollis. I am not going to be quiet anymore. The hearing was held in early September. Adelaide wore the same navy blue dress. She wore the same pearl earrings. She walked into the courtroom on her own. She did not take Hollis Pemberton's arm. She did not need it. Genevieve was in the second row of the gallery in a black dress and a black hat, looking like a woman attending the funeral of someone she had never quite forgiven for dying. Sterling was beside her. He was looking at his phone. Bartholomew was not there. When Adelaide was sworn in, she put her left hand on the Bible without flinching. She raised her right hand. She said, I do. She sat down. The attorney from Cambridge stood up. He was younger than the Hartford attorneys had been. He had a thinner face. He had been told Adelaide guessed that this witness had cracked once before and that she might crack again under the right pressure. He walked her through her marriage. He walked her through Reginald's last years. He asked her gently, with great show of compassion, whether her husband had ever in those last years said anything to her that had made her concerned about his memory. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him into the gallery and she found Genevieve's eyes. Genevieve was watching her. Genevieve was watching her with the same cold, pale eyes she had used at the reception line in 1984, when she had leaned in and told Adelaide in a whisper that she would never be a mother to her. Adelaide did not look away. "My husband," she said into the microphone, into the courtroom, into the silence, "had the clearest mind of any man I have ever known. He had it the day I met him in 1984. He had it the morning I brought him his coffee in March. He never forgot a name. He never repeated a story unless he meant to. He played chess with me on Sunday evenings and he beat me at it. And he beat me at it the Sunday before he died." The courtroom was very quiet. "He wrote his will," Adelaide said, with full knowledge of every word of it. "He told his attorney, Mr. Hollis Pemberton, that the disposition of the will was exactly as he wished it to be. And I will say one thing more, and then I will stop." She paused. She breathed. She found Genevieve's eyes again. "My husband," she said, "knew his children. He knew them better perhaps than they ever knew him. The will he left was the will of a man who had thought for 40 years about exactly what he wanted to do for the people he loved, and exactly what he wanted to leave to the people who had spent 40 years showing him who they were." She stopped. She folded her hands in her lap. The attorney from Cambridge looked down at his notes. He did not, after that, ask her another question. The motion was denied 17 days later. The third motion came in October. It came from all three of them this time. Bartholomew, Genevieve, and Sterling signing as joint petitioners alleged conspiracy. They alleged undue influence. They alleged the existence of secret arrangements between their late father and his wife. They demanded discovery into every aspect of Adelaide's finances over 40 years. They demanded the production of every document in the Cedar Brook house. They demanded Adelaide's testimony under oath in 3 separate depositions over 6 weeks. It was on its face a frivolous motion. It was on its face an attempt to bury her in legal costs. The papers had been written, Hollis Pemberton said in a tone of weary professional disgust, by people who did not expect to win. They expected to grind her down. They expected her at 68 to settle, to pay them out of whatever she had left in order to be allowed to live in peace. Hollis Pemberton sat across from her in the kitchen of the Cedar Brook house on the morning the third motion arrived. He had driven up from Boston in the rain. He looked tired. He looked that morning like a man who had been a litigator for 50 years and was beginning to feel every one of them in his knees. "Adelaide," he said, "you can fight this. You will win. The trust will hold. The deed will hold. But it will take 18 months, and it will cost even out of your discretionary fund perhaps $300,000 in legal fees. They know this. They are betting that you will write them a check to make it stop." She poured him a fresh cup of coffee. She sat down across from him. "How much do they want?" $2 million, to be split among the 3 of them, in exchange for a permanent withdrawal of all claims. $2 million. Yes. She looked down at the table. The kitchen of the Cedar Brook house was warm. There was bread on the cutting board. There was lavender in a stoneware jar. There was a bowl of apples Winnie Doyle had brought up the day before. She had been living in this house for almost 7 months. In those 7 months, she had begun very slowly to become a woman she had not been since she was a girl in her mother's kitchen in Dorchester. A woman who slept until she woke up. A woman who walked every morning on her own land with her own hands in the pockets of her own coat. A woman who had stopped somewhere around the end of the summer, asking herself whether the things she did with her days were the right things to be doing. And now in October, 3 people in expensive suits in 3 different cities were preparing again to take that from her. She lifted her eyes. "Hollis," she said. "Yes. I am going to invite them up here." "Adelaide. I am going to invite them up here, all 3 of them, and I am going to sit them down in this kitchen, and I am going to put one folder on this table, and I am going to tell them once that they are going to walk away, and they are going to walk away." Hollis Pemberton looked at her for a long moment. His tired old face did something small and fond. "Adelaide," he said. "Are you sure?" "Yes. Once you put that folder on the table, you cannot put it back on the shelf. They will know what you have. Even if they walk away tomorrow, they will know. They should know." "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, my dear. They should." The 3 of them came on a Saturday morning. Bartholomew drove. He drove a black Mercedes sedan. He had bought it, Adelaide knew, with the proceeds of his father's death, although the proceeds by this point in October had begun to look very different than they had looked in March. Genevieve sat in the passenger seat. She had a fox stole over her shoulders. The fox had a small glass eye. The eye looked, Adelaide thought, as the car pulled up, more alive than Genevieve's did. Sterling sat in the back. He had been drinking on the drive up. Adelaide could smell it on him before she had finished opening the front door. She let them in. She did not embrace any of them. She gestured to the long main room. She had moved over the last few weeks certain pieces of furniture. The leather chairs in front of the fireplace, the small table beside the kerosene lamp, the wedding photograph on the mantel. She had left on the wall above the fireplace every single photograph of herself that Reginald had ever taken. The 3 of them stood in the doorway of the long main room. They did not move. Bartholomew looked at the photographs. Then he looked at the leaded glass windows, then at the stone fireplace, then at the wide plank floors, then up slowly at the carved beams of the ceiling. She watched his face change. She watched it change very slowly, the way the face of a man changes when he is realizing that the thing he has been told is one kind of thing turns out to be a very different kind of thing entirely. "Adelaide," he said. "Bartholomew. This property." "Sit down." She did not say it loudly. She did not need to. The 3 of them sat down, Bartholomew on one of the leather chairs, Genevieve on the other, Sterling on the couch, his hands between his knees. Adelaide sat across from them in a wooden chair she had pulled in from the kitchen. She set on the small table between them a single brown manila folder. The folder was 3/4 of an inch thick. It was bound at the top with a brass paper fastener. She did not open it. She did not have to. "There is a folder for each of you," she said quietly, "on a shelf in a small room 20 feet from where you are sitting. Your father assembled them over a period of 40 years. He never used what he found. He told me in a letter that he believed information was a thing you kept in case you needed to protect someone you loved." She paused. She looked at Bartholomew first. "Yours," she said, "concerns 11 real estate transactions executed through shell entities between 2017 and 2023. The State Department of Revenue would find it interesting. So would the Internal Revenue Service. The total tax evasion comes to $4.1 million by your father's calculation, and your father was thorough about such things. Bartholomew did not move. His hands on the arms of the leather chair had gone white at the knuckles. She turned to Genevieve. "Yours," she said, "concerns 3 divorces. In each one you concealed assets from the man you were divorcing. In one of them, you destroyed a man financially who was in fact not the wealthier party. He died in 2016. He had a daughter from a previous marriage. The daughter would, I think, find your father's files very interesting. So I expect, with the Massachusetts Bar Association, when they considered the conduct of the attorneys you used." Genevieve's mouth opened. Genevieve's mouth closed. Adelaide turned last to Sterling. "Yours," she said, "concerns a side entity that does not appear on any of your firm's filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission. $18 million in client funds have been routed through it irregularly since 2014. The pattern is deliberate. The pattern is multi-year. The federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of New York would your father believe take the case on a Tuesday?" The room was silent. Sterling on the couch had put his face in his hands. She waited. She waited until the silence had gone on long enough to do its own work. Then she leaned forward. "Your father," she said, "did not raise me. He did not raise any of you. Each of us came to him in our own way, and we made of him what we could, and he made of us what he could, and in the end, he died in a bed in Beacon Hill on a Tuesday morning in March. But he did teach me one thing in 40 years of marriage. He taught me that information in the right hands is its own form of mercy, and in the wrong hands, it is something else." She paused. "You are going to withdraw the 3rd motion. By the end of next week, you are going to abandon all further claims against my husband's estate and against this property and against me. You are going to do this in writing executed by all 3 of your signatures with notarization, and then you are going to leave me alone." She looked at each of them. "If you do this, the folders stay on their shelves. They will stay there for the rest of my life. When I die, my will instructs that they are to be destroyed without being read." She paused. "If you do not do this, I will deliver each folder by personal courier to the appropriate authority by the end of the month." She sat back. She folded her hands in her lap. "You have until 5 o'clock on Monday afternoon." Bartholomew was the first to find his voice. "Adelaide, listen. There is more than one way to look at any of these, Bartholomew. Yes. I am 68 years old. I have been listening to your voice in this family for 40 years. I am not interested in another sentence of it." He closed his mouth. He did not open it again. The 3 of them stood up slowly like a single body. They walked slowly toward the front door. At the threshold, Genevieve stopped. She turned. Her cold, pale eyes met Adelaide's across the long main room. "You," Genevieve said. Adelaide waited. "You were never our mother." Adelaide rose from her chair. She walked slowly the length of the long main room. She stopped 6 feet from the door. She looked at Genevieve. She did not raise her voice. "I never wanted to be," Adelaide said. She closed the door. She did not slam it. She closed it the way a woman closes a book she has finished reading. The withdrawal of the 3rd motion arrived in Hollis Pemberton's office at 3 o'clock on the following Monday afternoon. It was signed by all 3 of them. It was notarized. It was unconditional. Hollis called Adelaide at 3:15. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Adelaide." "Yes, Hollis." I have been a litigator for 51 years. I know, and I have never, in my life, seen anything quite like that. She held the receiver in her hand, and she looked through the leaded glass window of the kitchen at the autumn light on the gardens. Hollis. Yes. Did Reginald ever know it would come to this, that I would have to use what he left? Adelaide. He hoped you would never have to. He told me the last time I saw him that he hoped his children would surprise him, that they would walk away, that you would keep the folders sealed. They didn't surprise him. No, my dear, they didn't. And he knew they wouldn't. He suspected. And so he prepared me anyway. Yes. She closed her eyes. Thank you, Hollis. Thank you, my dear. The Beacon Hill house went on the market in November. It was listed at $4.3 million. It sold after 9 months on the market in August of the following year for $2.7. The mortgage Reginald had taken out in 2022 consumed nearly all of the proceeds. The historic preservation easements had scared off 2/3 of the buyers. The third buyer, a hedge fund manager from Greenwich, had paid below, asking after his lawyer had finished reading the easement language. After commissions and closing costs and the satisfaction of the mortgage, Bartholomew, Genevieve, and Sterling each received from the sale of the family home approximately $94,000. Bartholomew, Adelaide heard later, had spent his share clearing back property taxes on one of the 11 shell entities. The investment trusts performed exactly as Reginald had designed them to perform. Bartholomew failed his first character evaluation in February. The retired federal judge Ellsworth Granby declined to authorize the annual distribution. Bartholomew sued him. The suit was dismissed at the demurrer stage. By the following year, Bartholomew had sold his country house in New Hampshire to pay his attorneys. Genevieve's trust required her to demonstrate 4 scheduled annual visits with her own children. Her oldest son had not spoken to her in 9 years. He did not begin speaking to her now. The trust paid her in the first year a token amount of $40,000. In the second year, it paid her nothing. In the third year, the trustee initiated proceedings to redirect the principal to charity on the grounds that the conditions had become permanently incapable of fulfillment. Sterling tried to manage the private equity firm himself. He had never run anything in his life. The firm filed for Chapter 7 on a Wednesday in October, 2 years and 4 months after his father had died. The federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of New York did not in the end take the case. The case had not been delivered. The folder on the shelf in the small mahogany-walled study in the stone house in Cedar Brook remained where Reginald had placed it. Adelaide had given her word. She kept her word. In the spring of the second year, she found the last envelope. She had not been looking for it. She had been cleaning out the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk in the study. The drawer had been stuck. She had wrestled with it for half an hour with a small flat-bladed screwdriver before it finally gave. At the back of the drawer, behind a stack of old appointment books, was a single envelope. It was sealed with the same red wax. It had the same handwriting on the front. For my Della, to be opened when the trouble is over. She carried it out to the porch. She sat down in the wicker chair wherein old photographs that hung on the walls of her own house she had been photographed sleeping in the sun. She broke the seal. There were 2 pages this time. Della, if you have found this envelope, the trouble is over. If the trouble is over, then I want you to know one final thing. There is another deed in the bottom drawer of this desk, behind the appointment books. 20 acres. The parcel adjoining the western edge of your property. I bought it in 2001. I have held it in your name ever since. There is also a fund, $500,000. It is at the Berkshire County Savings Bank in your name. It has been earning interest quietly for 15 years. I do not want to tell you what to do with it. I want to tell you that you have spent 40 years caring for other people's lives, and I would like the next thing you build to be a thing of your own. A garden, a school, a foundation, a library, a place for women who have spent their lives the way you spent yours, and who have come at 68 to a moment when no one knows what to do with them. I do not know what you will choose, my Della. I only know that whatever you choose will be good. I love you. I have loved you in silence because I was a coward. You deserved a voice that I never gave you. Use mine. Reginald. Adelaide put the letter down. She looked for a long moment at the autumn light on the gardens. The roses were going over for the year. The herbs in the kitchen garden were brown at the edges. The fountain, which she had had restored the previous summer, was running clear. She had been thinking for some weeks about the letters that had begun to arrive. They had started in the spring. The first one had come from a woman in Pittsfield, 64 years old, widowed. Her stepson had taken the family farm. She had read about Adelaide somehow. Hollis Pemberton suspected an article in a small probate journal that no normal person should ever have read, and she had written to ask whether she might come and speak with her. The second letter had come from a woman in Lenox. The third from a woman in Stockbridge. By the end of the summer, there had been 11 letters. 11 women in late middle age or early old age who had been quietly destroyed by the families they had married into. Adelaide had read each letter. She had answered each letter in her own hand on her own stationery. She had invited 2 of the women separately to tea. She had begun somewhere in those long, quiet afternoons on her own porch with the fountain running and the leaves coming off the oaks to think. She read Reginald's letter again. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. She stood up. She walked slowly in the autumn light down the stone path of her own garden to the edge of the lawn where the trees began. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned around and she walked back toward the house with the letter in her pocket and the fund at the Berkshire County Savings Bank in her name and the 20 acres behind the western tree line her own. She knew now what she was going to build. The Ashcroft house opened in the spring of the 3rd year. It was housed in a small white clapboard building on a piece of land along the eastern edge of Adelaide's property. The building had been a schoolhouse once in the 1880s. Adelaide had bought it from the town for $1. She had restored it with money from the fund Reginald had left her over the course of a year. The house had 6 bedrooms. It had a kitchen large enough to feed 20 people. It had a long room with bookshelves and a stone fireplace where the women who came could sit and read or talk or simply be silent in each other's company. It was not a shelter. Adelaide did not like that word. It was a place, she said, in the small ceremony she held on the front lawn the morning the doors opened, where women who had given everything and been left with nothing could come and remember that they were not in fact nothing. There was no charge. There was no application. There was a phone number listed in 3 local newspapers and on a small website Caroline, who had become over the previous year the closest thing to family Adelaide had in this world, had built for her. The first woman to come was a woman named Dorothea Pinckney from Albany, 67 years old. Her late husband's children had sold her house out from under her. She had been living for 3 months in a motel. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in May with 2 suitcases and a small wooden box of photographs. Adelaide met her at the front door. Adelaide showed her to her room. Adelaide brought her a cup of tea. Adelaide sat with her on the porch in the late afternoon sun, while Dorothea Pinkney looked out at the gardens and did not speak for almost an hour. When she finally did speak, she said only, "Mrs. Ashcroft, I have not had anyone bring me a cup of tea in a very long time." Adelaide looked at the woman beside her. She looked at the gardens. She looked at the long line of oaks at the edge of the property. "You are home now," Adelaide said. That was the 2nd year. By the 4th year, the Ashcroft house had taken in 19 women. By the 6th year, it had taken in 41. Adelaide herself in those years became the woman she had not in her entire life expected to become. She walked every morning on her own land. She sat on her own porch in the evenings. She read in a chair by the fire with a small dog at her feet, a brown mutt named Chester who had appeared at the kitchen door one cold November night and never left. She had visitors. She had Caroline up on weekends. She had Hollis Pemberton, who lived to be 92, up for tea on the last Sunday of every month. She had Winnie Doyle, who taught her in the long afternoons of her 70th year how to cure her own ham. She did not, after that final morning, see Bartholomew or Genevieve or Sterling again. She did not need to. She kept her promise. The folders stayed on their shelves. She sat on her porch on an evening in early October in her 74th year. The leaves were turning. The light was the long red light of New England in autumn. The oaks at the edge of her property, the same oaks that had stood there when her husband had inherited this place from his uncle, and the same oaks that would stand there long after she was gone, were on fire with it. She had a glass of red wine in her hand. She had Chester at her feet. She had on the small table beside her chair the wedding photograph from 1984, the one with Genevieve in the background frozen in mid-kiss, mid-cruelty, the one she had carried out of the Beacon Hill house in a cardboard box on the morning she had thought she was leaving everything she had ever loved. She had moved the photograph the year before from the mantel of the long main room out here to the porch. She liked in the autumn evenings to look at it. She liked in the autumn evenings to look at the young woman she had been, and to think about how little that young woman had known, and how far that young woman had come, and how much of what had been lost and taken and stolen had been in the end the slow, patient gift of a man who had loved her better than he had ever been able to say out loud. She thought sometimes about the chess, about the Sunday evenings in the last years of his life when Reginald had set up the board on the small table in the library of the Beacon Hill house, and they had played, and he had won every single time with the same patient, quiet smile. She had thought at the time that he had been teaching her how to lose. She had been wrong. He had been teaching her all those years with his careful pieces and his quiet hands how the game was actually played, how a player who plans far enough ahead and who is patient enough and who is willing to look like he is losing for as long as it takes will in the end take the board. He had played his game. He had played it for 40 years. He had played it with her in this house, in this letter, in those folders, in this fund, in this porch, and these oaks, and this dog at her feet, and this glass of wine in her hand. And the most extraordinary thing, the thing she sometimes thought about when she could not sleep, was that he had not been playing the game to win. He had been playing the game to teach her how to play it herself, so that when the moment came, in a kitchen with a folder on a table and 3 pairs of cold eyes across from her, she would be ready. She had been ready. She set the wineglass down on the small table. Chester lifted his head. The sun was going down behind the oaks. The fire was going in the long main room. She could see the soft red flicker of it through the leaded glass windows. Inside, in the big house behind her, two of the women who were staying at the Ashcroft house this month, Dorothea Pinkney, who had come and stayed and become her closest friend, and a newer woman, Constance Bellwether, who had arrived 3 weeks ago, were setting the table for dinner. She could hear their voices faintly through the open door. She could hear them laughing. She had not, when she was 28, and she had stood in a chapel in Boston, in a borrowed lace veil, ever imagined a sound like this. Two old women, laughing in her kitchen, in a house she had built with her own hands, and the patient love of a man dead 7 years. Adelaide Ashcroft, 68 years old, when she had walked into Hollis Pemberton's conference room with nothing but a borrowed name and a borrowed dignity, was now 74. She had her own name. She had her own dignity. She had her own house, and she had beyond every measure of what she had once thought possible her own life. The light went down. The oaks went black against the orange sky. The first stars came out over the Berkshires. In the long main room behind her, somebody put another log on the fire, and the flames climbed up, and the windows of the house glowed like a lantern in the dark. Adelaide picked up her wineglass. She raised it in the soft autumn evening in the direction of the fading western sky. "To my Reginald," she said quietly. She drank. She set the glass down. She stood up slowly the way a woman of 74 stands up after a long evening on her own porch. She put her hand on Chester's head, and she walked in the gathering dark through the open door of her own house into the warm light and the laughter and the long, full, late chapter of her own life.